You just watched him lead the Ohio State Buckeyes to a national championship on Monday night. Could Will Howard be an option at quarterback for the Browns in the draft this offseason? I'll tell you what I think coming up next on the Locked On Browns podcast.
You are Locked On Browns, your daily Cleveland Browns podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up, Dog Pound? I'm Spencer German, your host of the Locked On Browns podcast. I'm proudly covering your Cleveland Browns each and every single day in the land and on the road. Will Howard to the Browns. Is it a reality that could play out here in the coming months? I'll tell you what I think about that conversation coming up next. Also, what is the goal for the Browns in 2025, and how does that goal then impact what options the Browns have at quarterback? Because I think there are different routes that they would be taking depending on what they sort of want their goal or their expectations will be in 2025. I do want to thank you for being an everydayer at the Locked On Browns podcast and making us your first listen every single day. Today's episode is brought to you by our friends at Gametime. Download the account, use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Now, let's get after it here because many of us here in the great state of Ohio watched Will Howard ball out against Notre Dame in the national championship on Monday night, lead the Buckeyes to victory and to hoist their ninth national championship in program history in dramatic fashion. We know the storylines, coming back from the Michigan game and how just what a rock bottom moment that felt like for the program to rattle off 4 straight wins against some of the best teams in college football and get to this stage where they win it all. From a college football standpoint, from a sports standpoint, it's one of the best stories, not only in college football this year, maybe ever. And there might not be a single player who did more for themselves with a run in the playoffs than Will Howard, because I think especially with the Michigan game being sort of a lasting image of him as a player and of his season, his only season with Ohio State. This guy was on an absolute tear throughout the playoffs against, again, some of the best teams in the entire landscape of the sport this year. He was brilliant against Tennessee. He was brilliant against Oregon. Some of the passes in those 2 games alone were the best passes we've seen from Will Howard this season. I thought the one he dropped in a bucket that they've shown on a highlight reel over the last few weeks and even last night a little bit to Emeka Egbuka for the touchdown against Oregon, I thought that was maybe his best throw of his career, but certainly of his time here with Ohio State. Just an impressive ball. And there was others in the Texas game. There was more even last night against Notre Dame. And I think what was most impressive about every step of the way through this run, but especially last night against Notre Dame, was just the poise that he showed. The reason Ohio State went and got him and opted to get Will Howard over a Kyle McCord. And it revolved around his ability to have a short-term memory, forget about the bad plays, forget about the interceptions, and just play with a lot of poise and professionalism and not tense up in key moments. And I thought that's maybe the thing that was on most display for Will Howard throughout this run of the playoff. And he, aced that test, flying colors in that regard, from his ability to sort of do that and execute that and lead this team to a win and a national championship. It was impressive. It was incredible. But that brings us to the next phase of this conversation, because there was some stuff, there was talks on social media, some reports and rumors from the scouting community just about what Will Howard has done for himself from a stock standpoint, the big boards during this run to a title. What it's meant for him, what it's meant for his potentially where he's going to get drafted coming up in April. And I do find this one of the more fascinating stories now as we close the door on the college football season and look ahead to, the full draft process for guys like Will Howard and everybody else, that's entering the league. I am fascinated by, his story and where he ends up, because we know this quarterback class in general has been, touted as not being overly impressive it's drawing, shades of the 2022 class. That was obviously not a very good one with Kenny Pickett and Malik Willis. And so with that sort of being the backdrop to the narrative about this group already, Will Howard is somebody that you could see climb up boards based off of a good Senior Bowl performance. He will be at the Senior Bowl coming up next week. So I'm fascinated to see what he does with those opportunities and what that means for him to further his draft stock in the weeks and months ahead. Now for the Browns, this doesn't mean I don't think he's going to ever reach, by the time April rolls around, a stratosphere where he's being talked about with Cam Ward and Shedeur Sanders. I think it's those two and everybody else. But Will Howard maybe has turned himself into and could further turn himself into a perennial maybe a day one pick, potentially, maybe a late first rounder or something like that. If at the very least, I think he has cemented himself and solidified himself as a day two guy. My biggest thing, and listen, if that's the case, Browns certainly aren't taking him at number 2 overall. I think that's out of the question. But as we go through the different scenarios of what the Browns might try to do at quarterback, maybe bring in a veteran and draft a guy in a later round, I'm fascinated by Will Howard as a prospect for Cleveland. That you have this option, this route that you can take where you sort of wait and sort of develop somebody who's a day 2 guy maybe, and if you decide not to take a quarterback with that number 2 overall pick, it's a potential option for them. I like Will Howard a lot. I like his poise. I've been enjoying every single second of his ride and his run with the Buckeyes throughout this college football playoff. I'm still not necessarily sold on him as an NFL prospect or an NFL quarterback. First of all, a lot of his throws were behind the line of scrimmage stuff where, he's got so much talent on that Ohio State team that they were able to kind of make plays in space and create off of like his limitations, if you want. I do think he has some. I've talked to people who studied his tape more intently than even I have, as somebody who follows Ohio State, and some of the people who are more like in talk or scouting conversations on him. And, the right now, a lot of the narrative with Will Howard is like Ohio State won not because of him, but with him. And he wasn't going to make the big mistakes necessarily. He wasn't going to cost you a game in a big way, but, he wasn't doing anything exceptional to put them over the top. Now, that's what I think was interesting about the playoff run, is that there was moments where he did do that. The throw on third down with Jeremiah Smith on Monday night, where he, takes the deep shot. I mean, that's a ballsy throw for anybody. And I thought it was impressive for him to sort of make that call and make that play. So I came away impressed overall. I still don't know if I believe Will Howard is a bona fide franchise quarterback in this league. Do I think he's worthy of a day 2 pick? Sure. And so where the Browns come into play with this is if they go the route of, well, and let me say this too. His pre-draft process will be important to watch. And maybe he changes himself. Maybe he turns some heads and he becomes a more realistic, option as a starter in this league. And we change our opinions about him. Sitting here today, though, on January 21st, I don't feel that way about him. That doesn't mean the Browns can't take him. Again, if they decide to go the route of let's sign a veteran, let's get a veteran, have a bridge to a rookie, and he's the rookie that you're sort of hoping to develop here, I can wrap my head around that. I could get behind something like that. But I don't know that I'm expecting a lot from Will Howard as a franchise quarterback. He strikes me as somebody who could be like a solid player in this league, maybe a veteran journeyman style backup who bounces around a little bit. But I'm at least intrigued by what he brings to the table. I ultimately think, though, drafting him and thinking that he's going to become the next great Browns quarterback and the savior of the franchise at that position is a futile, mental process for any fan and anybody involved in this team. I just think he's shown. I think there's some stuff in his game missing that doesn't make me think he's that guy. And again, maybe I'll be proven wrong throughout the pre-draft process, but that's where I'm at with Howard right now. He's got a lot to prove because the team around him was so good. I mean, all the guys that play around him are perennial day one first round picks. I think there's still sort of a stigma attached to him, and I do think there are still some limitations. We'll see if he can shake those things through the process of leading up to the draft. But in the meantime, if the Browns decide to go that route as him being a day 2 guy, fine. I just don't know if I'm, sold on Will Howard as that franchise quarterback the team has been looking for, and frankly, the team is coveting right now as they make a big transition at the position. How do you feel about Will Howard? You can let me know, obviously, in the comments section of the Locked On Browns podcast YouTube channel. You can also hit me up on social media at Spencito_. Speaking of this next conversation is, I want to know what the expectation and the goal should be for the Browns next season. And that actually is going to impact likely what they decide to do with the quarterback position. We'll talk about those two things coming up next right here on the Locked On Browns podcast. As I talked about in relation to Will Howard, it is a glorious day because the Ohio State Buckeyes are national champions. And I get to say that I saw the Buckeyes in person this year. My wife and I, we went to the Michigan game this year. It was our first time checking out the game. And while we were obviously disappointed that day for obvious reasons, we will forever remember that we got to see an eventual national championship team in person. And it was all thanks to our friends at Gametime. I'll tell you, my ticket buying experience went so smoothly ahead of the game. Gametime has now become my favorite app for buying tickets. Plus, they now have new features like the Gametime Picks, which make it so much easier to get tickets to your favorite events, to filter out the fluff, and essentially shows you your incredible deals on great seats so you don't have to waste time searching through thousands of tickets. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms may apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. Download Gametime today. What time is it? Game time? So it might be a little too early in the offseason to start setting expectations for what the Browns need to accomplish next year or what the Browns should be accomplishing next year. From their standpoint, it might be a goal of what they're trying to achieve next year. And yes, the overarching goal is always going to be win the Super Bowl. We know that. But I do think this team needs to take a step back. And after a year where that was sort of the standard and that was realistic for this team, people thought they were a dark horse Super Bowl contender. Clearly that didn't happen. They finished 3-14. Things got away from them. It was brutal. It was ugly. It was not what anybody expected or wanted from this Browns team. So as you turn the page into 2025, and there's a lot that still has to happen. There's going to be moves made in the offseason, free agency. There's going to be guys retained, guys not retained. There's going to be changes to the roster. There's already been changes to the coaching staff. There's going to be draft picks that come in that could change the outlook of this team in either direction, either for the better or for the worse. But when I think about where this team is at currently, GM and head coach, who I do think are entering a pivotal year in their tenures with this franchise, because if they don't get it turned around this year quickly and they don't show some signs of progress, their jobs are on the line. Like their jobs are at stake. I think that's not hyperbole to say. And if they put together another 3-14 season, or maybe a few wins or losses, obviously either direction over that, I think they're probably gone, and you're starting fresh with a new regime next year. So they have to think and I understand they can't make moves this offseason. I've said this on the podcast. They can't make moves this offseason out of fear of losing their jobs. That's just not a good way to do business. It makes you desperate. You do stupid things that way. So they can't operate that way. That much is clear. That much I have said. But I do think, that is going to always factor into how a regime goes about building their team, understanding where they're at, and understanding that there might not be a 2026. There might not be another year if they don't turn things around quickly. So they're going to have to make some moves that make sense to keep this team in a direction of winning. Now, they have said they're going to do that. Andrew Berry's made it clear that is a priority for this team. But in what I guess end game that looks like, I think is the component I'm looking for here. Because again, you're a year removed from saying this team should be a Super Bowl contender. Now I think the expectation needs to just simply be, listen, get back to the playoffs. And if you get back to the playoffs, I think Andrew Berry and Kevin Stefanski steady the waters on their job security. They calm people down. They get everybody back on board. Everyone feels good again. That's what it feels like to me. The expectation is going to be for 2025, and probably what it should be for 2025. But I also understand where fans are obviously frustrated with how the Deshaun Watson situation panned out. They're essentially trying to keep a window open that felt like once Deshaun got hurt, and now it's likely he's done for the 2025 season, and that whole relationship in a whole is slowly going to be breaking apart. It does, like in many respects, that does symbolize almost an end to this. You thought you were going to be a title contending team for the Browns. They're trying to extend it as long as they can. They're trying to keep it open by making the right moves this offseason to the roster to fix this team and keep them on a trajectory towards winning. So I understand where some fans might be frustrated, but I do think, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, like you might feel differently about this. Maybe you still believe the goal is Super Bowl and this roster is good enough to compete. I mean, I've said here on the show that I believe this roster isn't, like, we didn't overrate this roster. That was a topic of conversation after the season, was like, did we overrate how good the Browns really were? No, this is a talented roster. They got players like Denzel Ward. They got Myles Garrett coming off of, obviously, last year winning Defensive Player of the Year. They have talent. Some of it was guys who were playing above the mean, I guess, of their play in 2023, regressed maybe back to the mean and weren't quite as good this year. And some guys, regressed, weren't making the plays they were the year before, and you got to have better play in certain areas. So there's no denying that. And those are the areas that you look to address in the offseason, fix some things, adjust some things, and get those areas sort of shored up so that you feel better about how things are going to look next season. But yeah, like I don't think this roster is that bad. I also just think though, like, you almost need a cleanse year is maybe a good way to put it. You need a year where it's just get everybody back on the same page, prove that you are still the right people to lead this organization. And, let's see what they can do as they blaze into this future that looks a little tenuous, looks a little tumultuous, and see if they can sort of dig themselves out of it with a trip to the playoffs. If you do that, I think it takes care of some things. If you do that, I think it calms people down. If you do that, I think it gets people back on board with this organization still has a chance to be competitive and still has a chance to extend, again, that window of contention that I alluded to. Now, what I think is interesting off of this, and this is what I want to talk about coming up next, is what that means for what you're going to do at the quarterback position. Because I do think, like, the playoffs proved it in spades this year, that if you don't have one of the top tier guys at that position, you're only going to get so far. We know the Browns have been linked to, maybe not a dozen. That's not fair. I don't think it's that many. But we know the Browns have linked to a handful of veteran quarterbacks, journeyman quarterbacks, resurrection projects, or, reclamation projects is the word I was looking for. Resurrection projects is something completely different, I think. Like that, those types of players, and that isn't something that excites you or excites this fan base as a whole. But it might be the hand that they're dealt just because of the dicey situation they're in with the Deshaun Watson contract still on the books and sort of hanging over their heads right now. But what I think is interesting, and the reason I asked the question about expectations, is like, if your expectation isn't the Super Bowl, I think that leaves every quarterback option on the table. And so I do want to talk about that with you next, coming up on The Fan, what we learned from the playoffs this past weekend, that maybe pointed to only being able to get so far, and why that matters when it comes to what the Browns are trying to achieve in 2025. We'll get into it a little bit more. I got more thoughts on it coming up next, right here on the Locked On Browns podcast. It's playoff time, and if you're like me, you want to make the most of these final weeks that we have football in our lives. That's where PrizePicks comes in. If you love football and you want a chance to win real money, well, PrizePicks is the place for you. It's the best way to turn your sports opinions into cash with daily fantasy player projections. With PrizePicks, it's simple. All you do is pick more or less on player stats like total passing yards or rushing touchdowns, and for a shot to win 1,000 times your money. You can make your picks in less than 60 seconds, and whether you're looking for a flex play to boost your payout or you want to cash out quickly, PrizePicks has got you covered. This week, there's going to be some good fun. There's going to be some fun stuff on the table. I like a Josh Allen rushing touchdown. maybe I might even play 2 Josh Allen rushing touchdowns. I think his legs are going to be a big factor in that Chiefs game. I also like, Travis Kelce going over, maybe 100 yards because he tends to have big games this time of year. And PrizePicks also gives you cool promos like their Taco Tuesday discount and much more. Here's a special offer for Locked On NFL listeners. Download the app today. Use code Locked On NFL instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. That's PrizePicks. Run your game. So, off of the topic we just had where I was talking about what the goals are for next season, what the expectation should be for this team next season, I think if the goal is make the playoffs, I think that the path at quarterback becomes stays, I should say, a lot wider, and there's more opportunities there for Cleveland. If it's reduced to you got to go chase that championship because that's the window that you're in right now, and that's how people feel, which again, I think we need to, where the bar was last year and how this season went, I think we all just need to take a step back and look at this team and say, it's okay if we just put the bar at playoffs. I don't think that's the end of the world. For a team coming off a 3-14 season, I think everybody, maybe I'm wrong. But if the expectation is going to just be get back to the playoffs, again, I think that keeps the net a lot wider on how far-reaching the Browns can go to find a quarterback this year, rather than if it's championship or bust or something along those lines, or people still believe that they need to be in that held in that esteem. I think that casts a much smaller net in terms of what your options are. To me, that basically comes down to you have to land the franchise quarterback in the vein of Jaden Daniels with that number 2 overall pick. And if you don't, then you might screw your organization up for years to come. So I think that's kind of an interesting part of this. And the other thing too is, and the reason I have this stance, look around the playoffs. We talked about about whether or not that's replicable for the Browns with the number 2 pick this year, a year removed from Washington having it, and how quickly they turn things around. I do wonder, like, it felt to me watching these games this weekend that you saw in real time that the bridge quarterback or the reclamation project quarterback, as I said last segment, only is going to get you so far. Like Jared Goff was the example that you could point to for a reclamation project quarterback that turned out to be better than maybe people expected, had maybe the right coaching staff and coordinators around him to sort of get the best out of him and get the most out of him. And so, he found this next level to his game, and look how far the Lions took that. But they fell short of those goals when they ran into a team that had a perennial franchise quarterback in the making in Jaden Daniels. And you look at the teams that are in the Final Four getting ready to play this weekend, and even some of the teams that made it to the division round in general. I mean, you had Bills, Ravens facing off against each other with 2 of the best quarterbacks in the sport. Look at the quarterbacks that are left. You got probably the 2 of the 2 best, if not 2 of the best. 2 of the best 4 Patrick Mahomes, I think, would probably be people's number 1 because it's Patrick Mahomes and what the Chiefs have obviously done of late. And you got Josh Allen opposite of that, who could win the MVP this year. So 2 of the best in the AFC, maybe the 2 best in the AFC. On the flip side, I think there's a valid argument to be made that Jalen Hurts and Jaden Daniels are the 2 best quarterbacks in the NFC. I mean, the NFC quarterback room or the NFC quarterback roster is not anywhere as like just incredibly talented as the AFC is. The AFC is a gauntlet of elite quarterback play when you got Burrow and Lamar and Mahomes. So those 2 guys on the NFC side might be the 2 best quarterbacks in the NFC. And that's saying something for Jaden Daniels, who's, already ascended to that conversation in year 1 in the NFL. So like that's what you face if you're trying to say it's got to be AFC Championship game or it's got to be Super Bowl. And you basically have to land that quarterback at number 2. You basically have to answer that question, the biggest question all teams are always trying to sort of have a solution to and an answer to in a very short amount of time and in a very sort of difficult setup to do so, because the draft is an imperfect thing. It's an inexact science. Just because you draft a guy number 2 doesn't mean they're going to pan out to be that quarterback. And maybe the Browns feel good enough about either Cam Ward or Shedeur Sanders to make them the franchise guy, and they think either's going to work. And, again, that will reveal itself in the months ahead if they feel that way. If that guy's not there, you're going to have to sort of pivot and look elsewhere, as we sort of talked about. So I do think, like, but that's why I think if the expectation is just like, listen, get this thing back on track and get to the playoffs, that is attainable with a bridge. Like, that's attainable with somebody like Kirk Cousins. That's attainable with somebody like maybe Daniel Jones as a reclamation project that we don't have all the answers on yet. I'm sort of more weary of Sam Darnold, as I've made clear, because those last 2 games, I think, sort of showed he reverted back to the player that he used to be. And so we've kind of now seen that reclamation project in action, and how it sort of ended was with a big thud for the Minnesota Vikings. So I don't know that I'm as intrigued by that, but there are some other options out there. I mean, I guess they could go after Aaron Rodgers. I kind of hope not, although I guess that would make for some good content here on the podcast every single week. But yeah, like the Kirk Cousins one is too obvious. If he becomes minimum type signing guy that has the relationship and the history with Kevin Stefanski, maybe like I said, Daniel Jones is an option as a reclamation project. But you see what I'm saying? Like, you can cast a wider net if the goal is, let's try to just get the train back on the tracks here, get this team back in a place of contending for the playoffs, and then figure out where we're going from here. But if the goal is championship, and that is going to always be the main goal, then yes, of course, you have to land one in the draft. I'm not saying that that's not where the Browns are at. The Browns very well might look at this class and say, we think that at number 2, we can get that guy. And if they do, great. Then you accomplish more than what I'm even laying out here. Like, you probably then take care of, if you land the guy and you hit on it, you land the guy that can get you to the playoffs next year. And again, course correct this disaster from 2024. You also then get the guy who can as quarterback. That you kill 2 birds with 1 stone in that way, and then you are talking about Super Bowl contention. But if they are weary of this class and they're not sure, and the goal is let's get to the playoffs, it gives the Browns more options this offseason as they explore what to do at that position specifically. The most important position, as we know, on the football field. Another episode down with you, Dog Pound. Thank you, as always, for joining me on the show to talk about your favorite football team during the off season. I know we're talking a lot of quarterback. I will get into a couple players tomorrow that I think they're Browns free agents that I think they should be focused on trying to retain. And I hope that you will continue to make us your first listen every single day. For your second listen, go check out one of the new Locked On NFL shows, or you can keep it local with Locked On Cavs, Locked On Guardians. Thank you for being an everydayer at the Locked On Podcast Network. I will talk to you again real soon. But for now, I'm out. Catch you later, Cleveland.